My name is Marcos Troyjo. I'm co-director of BRICLab, our Columbia University Forum on Brazil, Russia, India, and China. BRICLab is part of CGEG, the Center on Global Economic Governance, headed by the great Professor Jans Wehner. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank David Coughlin, Assistant Director of CGEG, Joanne Crawford, Kitty Dare, Dimitra, for the wonderful work in putting this together. And I also want to thank, of course, our panelists. Since 2 of the 6 panelists here are called Canuto and Sotelino, we decided to do it in the Italian Academy. But this is basically how our discussion today is going to work. We have 2 spheres. One has to do with the notion of BRICS as the rising economies that would, at one point in the 21st century, alter the tectonic shifts of the global marketplace. This was the vision by Jim O'Neill 12 years ago. In recent years, the economic performance of these 4 countries has been less than optimal. It's been disappointing. It's falling short of expectations. So our panelists will weigh in not only on the recent performance of these economies, but also on the outlook for the future. And the second sphere has to do with the fact that these 4 nations, along with South Africa, have embarked on a process of institutional building. For the past 5 years, they've been meeting every year at the level of heads of state and Minister of Finance. And this institutional building process will perhaps have a landmark in July 2014 as they meet in the beautiful city of Fortaleza in Brazil, where heads of state will review and perhaps adopt the statutes of a new development bank. So each of panel members will have from 12 to 15 minutes for their initial remarks. I'm going to start with Otaviano, Canuto, and Lloyd Pires. We're going to profit from their perspective coming from lateral institutions. And then each of the other 4, Anne, Atsi, Fernando, and Ivan, will talk about both the spheres from each of their countries' expertise. I thank you all very much. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing each of the panelists. You have their bios on the program. Let's get started. I give the floor to Otaviano Canuto. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcos. It's not only an honor, but a pleasure to be here and to with such an interesting panel, so that I will also learn a lot today. Let me kickstart the discussions, proposing some considerations on what has happened most recently with the previous hype with respect to the BRIC countries, which has become suddenly into a gloom. Now the fashion is reading, well, the media and has this feature in common with financial markets. Hype, things go from hype to gloom. And one can note a lot of pleasure of many analysts now churning out articles about the end of the BRICS, the end of emerging markets, and so on. As it happens often, truth is in the middle way. Neither the over-enthusiasm about the possibilities of growth and switch over, and I put myself in the line of those guilt of over-enthusiasm, because 4 years ago, a colleague and I produced a book, The Day After Tomorrow, in which we spoke about an incoming switchover of locomotives in the global economy. And so I was part of this enthusiasm. But the point is that what has happened doesn't allow anyone to dismiss the phenomenon of dramatic change in the global economy as something that was mistaken. And I will say a couple of things on this. And then I will make my own considerations. I've been working at the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank now for 10 years, so I would miss myself to give my considerations on the BRICS Bank, of course. But I will speak on my own, of course, on my behalf. So what has happened? Can we establish some common traits among the BRIC countries that may help explain why the hype went over into a gloom? I believe so. The first common trait in all these countries has been, to a lesser extent in the case of China, has been hubris, has been a feeling, a political appropriation of the so-called automatic march toward a switchover of locomotives. And such hubris led to complacency. One of the understatements, or one of the factors in my book with my colleague that was flatly wrong, was that we carried over the enthusiasm with the whole set of structural reforms that these countries had enacted prior to the crisis, and which could explain a lot why they were so resilient to the crisis, that led me, mistakenly, to take for granted that those countries would do whatever it would take for them to fulfill their fate, their destiny. Whereas reality is such that either because of the fear associated with a slump, which was the case of China, but in the case of the other countries, those structural reforms that would be necessary to make possible the exploration of the lines of growth that we laid out in our book didn't take place. They were postponed. For several reasons, there was a strong accommodation into the then apparently winning path. And I think this is reasonable to state with respect to Russia, to Brazil, to South Africa, and to India. Of course, this complacency intertwined quite well with the natural resistance from interest groups to undergo such reforms. You may let me spend just 2 minutes in outlining what were the lines of growth, of transformation that we foresaw at the time as granting the switchover. One, first of all, it was the good shape in which both private and public sectors of all these countries were in the aftermath of the crisis, which, by the way, gave them the scope to implement strong counter-cyclical policies and go over the crisis period reasonably unscathed. And obviously, I imagined that the possibilities in terms of infrastructure investments and consequent productivity gains coming out from a boom of infrastructure, particularly in countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, the growth of which is nowadays constrained by lack of infrastructure investments. If you had, with that combination seemed to be, one with great prospects. Countries that would have productivity raised by infrastructure investments in reasonably good shape on the side of their private and public sectors, and a lot of idle capital space dying to find new opportunities. So that was one. The other line, the other path or track through which all these countries could keep on growing quite well was the possible technological catch-up. Even if the frontiers of technological change in advanced economies might stagnate for a while because of the crisis, there still would be, and there still is, a wide scope for productivity increase from these countries by simply catching up in areas in which the existing technology can be more easily adapted, and so on. A third vector of opportunities for keeping growth was obviously the tremendous rise in the middle class in all these countries. The phenomenon of falling poverty in the world, and that's statistically something that we at the bank could, that's something that we keep the eye on, and it's a phenomenon, a worldwide phenomenon, apart from the fragile and conflict-affected states in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Fact is that the tendency of poverty to shrink for different reasons is a reasonably general phenomenon. And that, in the rising middle class, in many regards, including in terms of creation of domestic markets, also boded well for all these countries. And finally, through the commodity price, I still believe that we have not gone through completely we have not gone completely over the current super commodity cycle. The commodity price will not go down, with the exception maybe of oil because of shale gas, but they will not go to the low levels of previous decades in the other case. So all this set of opportunities comprised tracks through which we thought that naturally the BRICS would keep growing, and the search over local reserves was a matter of time. Now, all this, of course, precluded any grip of the investment opportunities from by interest groups. All this precluded any sort of retrocess towards some sort of state-led growth. And that was not what has happened in most of these countries. I would separate China because China never lost the eye on the ball of the necessary reforms. We at the World Bank had a great opportunity to understand this a lot through the process of producing an important report, in my view, which is the China 2030, which was co-produced by a think tank associated with the Communist Party and the World Bank. And in the process, this document took 2 years. It was part of the preparation for the government change in China. And it gave us clearly how at least a substantial and important component of the establishment in China has a tremendous clarity on the way forward, on the need to move beyond the previous growth model in many regards. We don't have the time to go over specifics. Well, my point is that the inflection in growth pace in all these countries that took place, it preceded the unwinding, the turmoil of last year associated with the announcement of the unwinding of the quantitative easing. The events after April, we came over an increasing perception that something rotten was there with these countries. And indeed, the growth had inflected. And by the way, let's not do the stupidity of comparing growth rates of these countries, given that they are at different stage. It doesn't make any sense to compare Chinese growth rates today with Russian or Brazilian growth rates. Chinese growth rates are to be compared to the period, for instance, in the case of Brazil, in the 50s and 60s, when Brazil was undergoing, badly or not, the transformation that China has been going through. At the same time, the weight and relevance of Russia is not necessarily associated with the growth of GDP in the last 2-3 years. What matters for everything associated with discussion BRICS and the takeover is the absolute size of these economies. Now, just to finalize this part on initial talk on the growth, the transformation, the hype and gloom, as an optimistic, I believe that the experience of the last 2 years has diminished the hubris, certainly, and may end up serving as a wake-up call. This is certainly the case of Brazil. My bet in the case of Brazil is that the wrong bets will not be doubled, and there has been a learning process through which, well, there is a cost in terms of GDP lost and lost investments and so on. But the fact is that even the PT government is changing its stance with respect to public-private partnerships in infrastructure and so on. The same also can be said about India. The great opportunity for India would be each one of these countries has its own agenda of structural reforms. Structural reforms is too generic an expression to serve for anything. In the case of India, for instance, I would highlight the opportunity to replace China in many labor-intensive manufacturers, provided that labor market regulation is changed. So my point is that the wake-up call may lead each one of these countries to enact now the structural reforms that might have been initiated 5 years ago. And to complete my initial thought, is there any sense about BRICS as a group, as a geopolitical group, and so on, right? Because let's keep in mind that originally when Jim Neal developed the concept, he was talking about markets, economies, national economies in the developing world with siding off with the minimum degree of financial sophistication to be destination of huge masses of funds. But also there was the implicit consideration that these countries were the large kids in their corresponding blocks, Russia, Indochina, South Africa. In the case of South Africa, with some complaints from Nigeria and so on. But the fact is that when our objective discussion today is something else, is no longer what Jim Neal was having in mind when he wrote his piece. Good for him, that gave him a life, a whole business life. But the point is that, does it make sense to talk about a BRICS group? Yes, as long as we are talking about in a specific agenda in which there is common interest of the countries around it. It's not something in abstract, the diplomats who get together and celebrate how big they will be and so on. This is foolish. So there has to be things, interests. What leads me to one possible example of this agenda, which is the BRIC Bank. Is there a convergence of interests among these countries around creating a new development bank? There are some reasons to believe that. And what are they? I've been, in my 10 years in the bank, I've watched how the role of multilateral institutions from the perspective of each one of these countries has been changing. These countries, with maybe the exception of India for infrastructure and maybe with the exception of South Africa for energy, these countries don't need the money coming from institutions like the World Bank, at least not money by itself. These institutions want to lend money to these countries, it's contrary-wise. And each one of these countries have had, to different degrees, developed their own projects on how to use the bank. In the case of China, we saw this. China used the bank as a source of knowledge in some areas and as a source of legitimacy and as a sounding board. A small digression, how late I am?
2 more minutes.
Okay. I saw in the case of, for instance, China, China asked the bank to do an evaluation of the Chinese export processing zones in Africa. And I had the privilege of being the vice president responsible for that task. And the first thing that came to my was, why us? Well, they can do this by themselves. No, they wanted an external voice. They wanted to have a sincere, a clear, policy-oriented evaluation of the export processing zones that they had implemented in Africa. my small point here is that these institutions, these countries, are starting to need multilateral instances that can be used by them for several purposes. And then the question comes, to what extent the existing multilateral institutions can serve that purpose? The answer to this question, don't ask me to give you a full one. Among other things, I want to keep my job. But the fact is that in order for these institutions, for an institution like the World Bank and others, to adapt themselves to be able to perform these functions, there will have to be changes in governance. And then changes in governance, so it's a game. I would say that the functionality of any new institution created by these governments will depend a lot on the higher or lower ability that they will have to transform the existing institutions to perform those functions. It is not a simple process because the ways by which governance of multilateral institutions is seen by all these countries, I can tell you, I've been at the board for 3 years and a half, they differ. The exercise of soft power through these institutions by hailing different images about what is to be the yardstick of development success and so on. They are quite different. So it's still an open question regarding whether the existing multilateral institutions would be able to accommodate this new necessity of these countries as they acquire new functions in the global economy. I hope there's still some discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pires. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, and my thanks to BRICLab and Columbia University for having me here. About 2 years ago, when I was living in Brazil, I met Marcos Troyjo, and we had a fascinating discussion about what BRICLab was trying to do. And I was thinking about how timely and appropriate that formation of this new unit was. And the reason it resonated with me is because, partly by accident and partly by design, I have lived and worked in 3 of the BRICS, in India and China and in Brazil, and worked on Russia, the 4th. And when you live in a country, aside from all the statistics, etc., that people put in front of you and you absorb, you build your own internal sort of unmapped sort of set of experiences that you hopefully will inform you when you make your investment decisions. For 22 years now, I have worked in the emerging markets, and I've worked with the IFC. The International Finance Corporation is one of the World Bank group of companies, but we work predominantly in the private sector. So we've tried to find companies in emerging markets that are viable and will become good models of corporate governance and environment and social standards. And we invest in them with the hopes of making money and in the hopes that they will create jobs and set standards. So what I want to do with you today is give you sort of a personal perspective on what's happening in the BRICS and what I think is the road ahead. The first perspective is that people's lives in these countries are improving and improving dramatically. Most of humanity lives in the BRICS. Most of the poor people in the world live in these countries. And if you look at the improvement in poverty levels over the past decade or even 2 decades, it's been astonishing. India has cut its poverty rate from 45 to 22%. In 2005, China had 400 million people that moved from rural areas to urban areas, all of them, most of them with jobs. And in Brazil has seen the Gini coefficient, which is the inequality ratio, drop dramatically, although it still remains one of the most unequal places in the world. So we've seen a real and genuine improvement in the standard of living. What this means is something that Canuto referred to, is that you have an emerging growing middle class. And that has profound implications over a long, long period of time. People in this cohort, okay, are going to demand governance, are going to demand transparency, they're going to demand greater choices in the supermarkets, they're going to want better infrastructure, okay? And whether it happens sooner or later, it will happen. And for me, this is the one and most important feature about the BRICS, and that is to do with its growing, emerging, demanding middle class. And you're starting to see aspects of this all over the place. Who would have believed that Brazilians would protest the building of stadiums at a high cost because the government had not spent money on infrastructure? Okay, this is the kind of stuff that we're beginning to see around the globe. The aspirations of this middle class are extremely important when you take a long view. Certainly, there might be hiccups along the way, and there will be. But if you think about, if you step back and take a long view, this is a group whose dreams and hopes will not and cannot be denied over time. In 1992, India almost defaulted on its sovereign loans. South Africa held its referendum on apartheid. The Berlin Wall had come down 4 years earlier, and Russia was coping with the loss of its satellite states. And the Earth Summit, the very first Earth Summit, was held in Rio. But also in 1992, Time magazine honored Ted Turner for being Man of the Year because of cable news network. And whether you agree or not with Ted Turner, I think there's no doubt that the information flows across the globe through cable TV and now through internet have made it a much more globalized world where people in every part know what's happening in the others. And again, that feeds into the aspirations of this middle class. The second overall theme I want to talk about is that within these BRICS, the private sector is flourishing. Now, it's flourishing in many cases, in almost every case, while state capitalism is also growing. Now, one view is that, yes, there are private domestic groups that have the protection of government, but it is also true that if you parse into the data and dig more deep than at the country level, there are subsectors where there is opportunity to be made. If you look at the current context today, the winds have changed. Clearly, we've moved from a situation where tailwinds of the past 5 years have now shifted, and these emerging economies are facing headwinds. We all know what they are. You have the prospect of the taper in the US, rising interest rates, depreciating currencies, slowing China growth, the commodity supercycle potentially ending, unit labor costs going up, and the risk of contagion from hotspots from Thailand to Indonesia, to Turkey, to the Ukraine, to Argentina, to Venezuela, it goes on. But if you look at the statistics around this, okay, are quite telling. If you look at the risk-reward trade-off that these groups of countries give you, and you classify them into developed countries, emerging countries, including the BRICS, and then what I call the EU peripheral countries. 5 years ago, the developing countries, the BRIC countries in particular, offered a higher return and a higher risk profile. 5 years later, what you see is that the developed countries, including the US and Western Europe, are offering returns that are pretty comparable to the emerging markets for much less risk. So it's little wonder then that emerging flows to the emerging markets are sort of dwindling. You also see that when it comes to productivity and the change in the pace of productivity, with the exception of Mexico, Indonesia, and I think Turkey, all the BRICS are showing declining levels of productivity in the pace of productivity. And finally, again, with the exception of China, structural reforms, okay, that's physical infrastructure, human infrastructure, and financial sector infrastructure have been sluggish at best in these economies. But all is not doom and gloom. I think it's important to go beyond these overall macro sort of stories and dig deeper into what's happening individually in all these countries. If you use 3 filters, as we have done in the IFC, and one filter being the ability and the willingness to reform given medium-term vulnerabilities of its macroeconomics policies, the second filter being changes in the working populations in these countries, a sort of demographic change. And third, the percentage of people moving to the middle class, a sort of income effect. What you see is quite a sharp difference between these 4 countries, including South Africa. China checks all the buttons. You've got a reform-minded ability and willingness in the government. You've got strong demand, and you've got reasonable income expectations. India and Brazil both actually lag on the reform side, but they do have strong demand and they do have income growth. South Africa has strong demand and doesn't check the other 2 boxes. And Russia, the metrics are pretty much flat across the board. Again, don't read too much into this sort of classification because rankings really do not mean a lot. If you look at equity valuations in these markets, okay, and you sort of look at price earnings ratios, price to book, enterprise value to EBITDA, what you notice is Brazil, sort of in many of the subsectors such as ICT, telecoms, transportation, health, education, power, checks many of the boxes, followed closely by China, then India, then South Africa, and again, Russia. So I think it's important to understand that the BRICS story notwithstanding from a macro level, there is and always will be pockets of opportunity for the private sector to make money and make decent, honest money if you appropriately target subsectors and companies in these countries. And finally, my third and final sort of theme that I want to explore today is one which is hard to capture in a phrase, but it's to do with the institution building and strengthening that is or isn't happening in these countries. You see, that emerging middle class is going to demand transparency, governance, etc. And when you look at these countries and the judiciary, the Environmental Protection Agency, the central bank and the stock exchange regulator, if you look at these sort of regulatory agencies and the institutions, what comes across strongly is how independent are they and how resilient are they going to be when a crisis hits. And we know that a crisis will hit. Okay? And to my mind, this is where BRICLab, the World Bank, and the private sector really needs to take steps right now. Because putting these institutions in place over the next few years, some of them already have them in place, but they could always be strengthened, is an important part of what I do believe is the road ahead for the BRICS. What will distinguish one from the other is not the short-term opportunity in this subsector or the other. It's going to be how level is the playing field, how open and transparent are the governance rules, do they have the kind of systems that allow and the political maturity to allow these institutions to thrive and flourish despite what might be happening in the outside world. So I would encourage the discussion that follows this to focus on this aspect, because I do think that if you dig beyond the macro sort of stories behind the BRICS, it's really the institutions that are long-lasting and we hope will be long-lasting that will be the differentiating feature between these BRICS as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Oops. So thank you, Marcos and BRICLabs, for having me here today. And thank you, all of you who are here in the audience, from taking time from your busy schedules to take part in this very topical discussion. Marcos asked me to give a few words about, what is the road ahead for BRICS from the China's perspective. And I don't pretend to be the voice of Beijing or anything, but I guess he has asked me to take it from this point of view, largely because Since 2008, I have been in regular contact and discussions with a lot of Chinese leaders. I was in Beijing during the financial crisis of 2008, and prior to being in academia, I had worked on Wall Street in a variety of roles, but my last role was in credit derivatives, and so I was able to work with a lot of government officials back then and continue to advise them on various issues going forward. And so from that platform, I'm able to sort of discern how the Chinese leaders think about a lot of global economic and political issues. And before I dive into how they think about BRICS, I just want to add that the BRIC acronym created by Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs was largely convenient to explain growth prospects to investors, which is not necessarily the way that China sees the world. China would probably divide this more as developed countries versus developing countries as opposed to the specific countries per se. But with that said, it's not to say that China doesn't have very productive and strategic relationships with Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. So I'll talk about them sort of more broadly from like a developing country perspective as well, since there are probably many other countries that people would say would eventually fall into this BRIC category. And also, when I talk about China's perspective, China's leaders really think more in terms of years, even generations, and not so much about the news cycle. And I know that the news cycle of late has been very negative. It's actually quite tied to financial markets as well. And so things do get exaggerated, as an earlier speaker had mentioned. But likewise, if you take the long view and see that, what's going to happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now, a lot of these news items are probably just going to be noise in the long run. And I think China does see a lot of these things as just, minor bumps on the road. While some of them, may be more challenging in the short term and they're not going to dismiss them, it's not something that would discourage their overall view of, how they see the world in terms of how BRICS go forward. And I would say that the news is good because I would say they see a very optimistic future. And I'll give you the reasons why. First of all, if we've looked at China in a very short period of time, in the last few decades, has developed an incredible industrial base. They're not alone in this. Obviously, Russia has a very strong industrial base too. But China has, gone a step further. So besides developing a very strong industrial base that was able to service manufacturing needs throughout the world, they were also able to really establish strong trade ties with countries all over the world that is really, on par with developed countries. China recently has surpassed the U.S. As the #1 trading nation in the world. And so with so much economic influence, they have then been able to create the next platform, which is to make their currency a very powerful currency and hopefully become a reserve currency in the not too distant future. And so with these three platforms, this would give China many degrees of freedom in terms of economic and political action. And so why would I be so optimistic about especially the third one, since China's currency is obviously not a reserve currency yet, but they've taken some very pragmatic steps and accelerated the development of this currency in use of foreign trade very rapidly. So if you think about it, China didn't use its currency anywhere in the world until 2009. So after the financial crisis, China decided that they were going to experiment with having 5 outside cities settle renminbi transactions. By 2011, they expanded it to 20 countries. And as of May of 2013, there are now over 160 countries that settle renminbi transactions. And so this is a very rapid increase of countries feeling comfortable using China's currency as a way to handle trade settlement. And as other ways to look at this, letters of credit, which is a form of financing, also was non-existent before. It was probably just 1% as recent as 2011. And then in 1 year, they basically surpassed the financing that is even done in the euro, which is only around just over 6%. And then China's letters of credit financing was almost 9%. So what we're seeing is an incredible comfort around the world to use China as an alternative source of credit, alternative source of investment funds. And so this, again, is something that is not assured any time in the near future, but it looks like it has a very high chance of succeeding. And China has made various announcements regarding using the Shanghai Free Trade Zone to test out opening the capital account of China so that the currency can be freely traded between foreign countries and onshore. So these are very exciting developments. And if China is able to achieve reserve currency status, which is a huge milestone, it will join a very elite club, which today consists really only of the euro and the US dollar. We know that the world can handle more than one currency, right? Because the euro's popularity as a currency actually surpassed that of the US after the financial crisis, but it still remains rather limited. It's mostly done around the Eurozone and isn't really used if a Euro country is not involved in the transaction, whereas the US dollar still remains the most international currency in terms of settlements because many countries will still use the US dollar even if the US is not a counterparty. And at this point, China settles about 11% of their trades in the renminbi currency, and the trajectory is very high. And so we can see that China can very much well join this club in the not too distant future. And when this does happen, this will certainly give more credibility to the new development bank that the BRIC countries are discussing, because certainly this will give developing countries an alternative source of funding and capital to further their own projects without necessarily the same strings that the World Bank would attach or the IMF would attach. And what would likely happen is that China would take its reserve currency and fund it with renminbi and allow other countries to also participate so that there are multiple stakeholders in this venture. And this would potentially accelerate a lot of infrastructure projects that are still sorely needed, as our previous speakers talked about. For instance, China is pretty much the lone country that has high-speed railroad networks all over the country at this point. And it is very possible that they would want to take this technology and export it and help build high-speed rail throughout Latin America and Africa. And by having this development bank, it makes things much easier for them if they are taking the lead to cut out a lot of red tape to get these things done with the nations that are also interested in these projects. And so I would say that these would be huge, enormous win-wins for all parties concerned, including the developed countries, because as we've seen, as Africa's growth rates have been the highest in the world, many developed countries from Europe and the US have gone in to make investments as well. So everyone benefits from the development of these countries. And I think that if you take this long view, then obviously the future looks rather rosy because we can see a lot of low-hanging fruit here. When China's already created a so-called roadmap for everyone else to follow so that nobody has to recreate the wheel. And as far as where China's headed, China has its sights on becoming like the United States, like Europe in terms of its sophistication in services and in technology. And so it has its own roadmap to shoot for. And so from this standpoint, I would say China remains rather optimistic about its future and as well as the future of all of their partners and neighbors. Of course, it's easy to be optimistic. It's another thing to execute on all these things, and it's not going to be easy. We know that political resistance is often the death knell for a lot of projects, but hopefully when there is enough communication and enough awareness of what technology does bring and all these benefits, it's very difficult for the folks to resist to do it forever. And so eventually you would have the sort of creative destruction that's needed to propel things forward. I would say that if there was any negative note, the one thing that I would say Chinese are cautious about is sort of the geopolitical implications of this, right? We've talked mostly about economic prospects, but of course you can't ignore the political implications that would come with strong development from developing countries. Many people would see this as, not necessarily a growing pie, but one where someone gains and others lose. And a lot of tensions can develop from that. And this will be, I think, one of the major challenges. Clearly, the Asia pivot that Obama's made by sending more warships and fighter planes into the Asia Pacific is not lost on China. The recent military joint exercises between Japan and India, also not lost on China. And so there is definitely danger of friction, and these, if ever military conflict does break out, that could certainly, slow down development significantly. We hope that that will never be the case, but I'll just wrap up now, and I really look forward to hearing your questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Atsi, Sheth, and I'd like to echo the previous speakers' thanks to Marcos and BRICLabs and you for attending today, and my pleasure at being here. I'm looking forward to both hearing everybody here and your questions. Marcos asked me to focus on India, or sort of the perspective on the BRICS from the vantage point of somebody who studies India professionally. And, as many of you may know, in about a month, India will start its election process. It will be run over several weeks, almost a month and even longer. And you may ask, why does a country need almost a month to have elections? We do it in a day here in the States. And the reason is that 800 million people are eligible to vote in India. Take that statistic home with you. 800 million people are eligible to vote in India. That's more than the combined voters in the United States, UK, Germany, France, Italy. I did the math. It's Europe plus UK plus the US. This is more than all those people combined, all the people that voted in elections in those countries. That's a lot of people. And the theme that I wanted to build on for today was, what does a government do that has to aggregate the interests of, these are just 800 million voters, there's actually a billion, right? Just as in China. But these billion get to vote and get you to be employed or unemployed every 5 years. So any government that takes economic policy action in India is really thinking about how they aggregate these interests. They're not really thinking about, well, what will it take for us to be still considered part of the BRICS in 2050, or to maintain a growth rate that's equivalent to China, or anything like that. They're thinking, how do I get these people to vote for me in the next election? And the answer to that, I think, explains India's growth trajectory in the last 10 years, and will continue to explain it in the next 10. But I would divide it as to some things worked for India in keeping this polity together, because this is not just 800 million people. These are 800 million people divided into several castes and cultures and languages, different income levels. There are very, very poor people in India. The per capita income is under $2,000, which is very low, the lowest amongst the BRICS. But there are also very, very rich people, people that make it onto the global billionaires lists every year. This is a highly unequal society. The census lists almost 70 languages spoken in that one country, which tells you a little bit about the diversity. And my favorite cliche, there are 300 ways to cook the potato in India, which tells you again how diverse it is. Holding it together over the last decade, I would argue, has been an economic policy that privileged redistribution to some sense. And this is why it happened. About a decade ago, more than a decade ago, there was a government in power that did everything by the book. They invested in highways. They deregulated certain industries. They encouraged business. Everything that a BRIC should have done to increase growth. Come election time, they were voted out of power. And one of the reasons they were voted out of power was because the large population of the very poor in India did not feel they were benefiting from all this market reform, all this investment in highways. Even though eventually, as we all know, that would have yielded fruit, even to the poorest, but it wasn't evident and it wasn't immediate. And they were voted out of power. So when the next government came into power, one of their themes was inclusive growth. And they decided that what they would do is follow policies that allowed growth to proceed, but also would be redistributed amongst the poor. And this was easy to do at a time when global liquidity was very high. This was the 2000s, when global trade was again at its peak, when commodity prices were rising, but not as much as to sort of make it difficult to trade. There was also, China was growing, Europe was growing, the US was growing. There were opportunities for investment, there were opportunities for inward investment. India indeed grew between 8 and 10% during those years. What did the government do with this growth? Its revenues went up significantly, and it decided that it would expand the subsidy schemes so that as food prices got higher, because growth was getting higher, and more people, demographically, more people were sort of entering the workforce, more young people being born who needed more nutrition, they would subsidize food. They would subsidize fuel, because of course global prices of fuel were out of reach for the average Indian, so they would subsidize fuel. They would subsidize fertilizers, because that is what helped grow the food that India doesn't import much. And that worked for a long time. This model worked because the revenues kept increasing because corporate profits were high. But personal income tax growth was not that high because, quite frankly, most people in India are not rich enough to pay income tax. And you can't burden the middle class with all the income tax payments. So income tax rates were kept fairly stable. Revenues grew because of corporate profits, and subsidies grew, and deficits were just fine. They were actually coming off. This model was also helped by the fact that the middle class, even though it did not pay higher taxes, did have a lot of savings, and those savings went into the banking system. And the government, the authorities, not just the government, but the central bank as well, had rules that required banks to invest some of this in government debt. So the government could, do all these subsidy programs, increase its deficits to some extent, and borrow at very low real rates because the middle class was savings, the savings were going into banks, and the banks were lending to the government at very low rates because the savings were high enough. All of this worked, of course, until growth was no longer as high as it was. So you had growth come off for reasons related to the global financial crisis, but also because in this model of growth, more attention had been paid to consumption and investment growth that followed consumption, but not as much to competitiveness. India was not becoming necessarily more competitive against its trading partners. And so when the crisis hit, there were some countries that could continue to grow. India was not amongst them because the inflow stopped coming. The savings, in fact, grew less and less because income growth was lower. At the same time, that food inflation kept rising. The cost of food kept going up. And for the average Indian, food is 60% of what they spend their income on. So when that goes up, they're not consuming anything else. At the same time, the middle class that had happily funded the government via the banking system for a long time, thinking, yes, I'm getting 10% returns on the deposits I make. Inflation is 4%. I'm good, 6% real returns. Well, when growth started going down and inflation stayed high because food inflation was high and interest rates did not go up, the middle class said, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to buy gold instead. And they started diverting. There's always been a cultural, sort of predilection towards saving in gold. And now real returns on financial deposits were no longer, high enough for the middle class to invest. So the government was in a bit of a bind. Its redistributive strategy no longer worked. Keeping, 1 billion people happy. Everybody was happy in the past. Money was coming in. The middle class was growing. Business was happy. The poor were happy. Suddenly, everybody was unhappy. The savers weren't getting real returns. They had to go into gold. The investors found interest rates getting higher, both because of the global crisis as well as because of high inflation locally. And the poor now found that, even though food subsidies helped a little bit, job growth and income growth was not as high as it had once been. So that sort of is why that model broke down in India. The repercussion of it, of course, was seen, and you were talking about how there were these problems that sort of predated the taper fears. All of this was kept contained within India until May 2013, when suddenly the markets realized that here's a country that we thought was going to be a shining star of growth, and not only in the last couple of years has it not been growing, its government's balance sheet has weakened significantly because of all the debt that the government took on. And this was a strategy that, the government was trying to mitigate the socio-political risk of having growth that didn't benefit the poorest. But what it did, in order to mitigate that socio-political risk, is took on a lot of credit risk on its own balance sheet. It just increased its debt to keep everybody happy. The market realized that. The market also realized that Indians are importing all this gold, which is feeding their current account deficit. They are a commodity importer, so they're importing oil, and oil prices, you may remember 2011, 2012, after the Arab Spring, they were volatile, but they remain quite high. So here's a country that may have been a shining star of growth at one point, but no longer is. And so you saw in May 2013, up until August, India was the worst performing currency. The rupee was the worst performing currency. This, I would argue, might have been a wake-up call, and I think that policymakers will always make decisions. I mean, we expect prudent policy to come out of policymakers because they are so wise. No, it doesn't happen that way. Policymakers respond to the constraints they are placed under. At some points, the constraints of democracy guide them to do things that are quite, they're increasing their own risk, they're damaging their own balance sheet, but they'll still do that because that's what makes political sense. When the external liquidity situation became far less obliging, policymakers changed course completely. So what you saw in India was, first some sort of quick actions like import bans on gold. That stopped the gold. But they also started reducing the fiscal deficit over the last couple of years, and including the most recent announcement. They did a lot of things like create an environment where real interest rates started rewarding savers and not consumers. They raised interest rates. And that also helped people channel their savings from gold back to deposits again. And the lesson from that was that you cannot have irrational policies or seemingly irrational policies continue forever, even if you're a BRIC and you're going to be by 2015 one of the strongest, one of the few stronger economies in the world, which India probably will be. It has the demographics, it has the private sector that's very agile, it lacks natural resources, but it does have human resources. I mean, arguably not as well educated and without access to the kind of healthcare that exists even in other BRICS, but it has these resources. So India will probably grow. But policies are important as well. And I think that's been one of the lessons that's been learned, that, if you're a BRIC, and if you, as you must, depend on international finance, your policies will have to be something that the market can accept, because the market will not fund you if you don't follow those. What does this mean for the future? So lesson learned that, you can't be fiscally profligate, you can't let your current account deficit go out of hand. The lesson learned has been that macroeconomic balance must be maintained, and I think that that will be something that future governments in India will have to follow. But what will happen to the socio-political risk if you're going to be cutting down subsidies, if you're going to be keeping interest rates at levels that incentivize savers? That's going to hurt investors who want cheap money. That's going to hurt the poor who want cheap food. How are you going to compensate for that? And the only answer, the answer which has always been true in economies worldwide, is competitiveness gains, that you grow. Growth is the answer, that if everybody is growing, some of these problems solve themselves. For India to grow is not automatic. You've talked about infrastructure. Infrastructure is clearly one thing where India lacks relative to other BRICS, relative to almost all its trading partners. The other thing is sort of human infrastructure as well, that access to education, healthcare, sanitation. India has a very poor record in terms of sanitation as well. Those are the sorts of things. You will likely not read about gains in these areas in the financial press because they're not happening at the central government level. They're happening at the state government level because that is where the rewards are. That's where governments are getting elected at the state government level for providing better infrastructure, better healthcare, better education. So that's where you'll see it happening in the future, I think. And I'll stop there on sort of India's own sort of growth perspective and talk a little bit about the second question that you raised, Marcos, which is, given sort of India's, it has to manage a billion people, economic policy has to create growth, what is India's stake in a BRICS institution or a development bank? And this, sort of, I'll share with you an anecdote, something that happened a few days ago. My 77-year-old mother called me, and she said, explain this to me. When your children call me up and say, Grandma, it's a thing, what does that mean? Like, spaghetti tacos is a thing, or cats on YouTube is a thing. What does that mean when the kids these days say that? And I said, a thing in current parlance means something that you and I could never have imagined to be possible or desirable, but now is sort of commonly accepted. Putting spaghetti in a taco is Tuesday night dinner for many people, or putting their cat videos up on video is commonly accepted. It's something that has become something that people enjoy. And the BRICS is to me, brings that to mind, that it was a very good research paper that talked about 4 countries, and I guess now 5, that didn't really have common interests with each other, that had commonalities in terms of size, in terms of growth potential, but not necessarily common interests. And now, this group of countries meets every year. They're going to set up an institution without sort of, India, for instance, not a commodity exporter, has not much natural resources. The other BRICS do. India, quite poor, doesn't trade much with many of the BRICS. With China, of course, everybody trades with China. But again, exports coal to China, imports manufactured goods from China. What would be India's interest in participating in such an institution? And again, to echo what you said, the interest is political, I think, and there is an economic benefit to having such a political interest. If you think of India's foreign policy and go back to sort of keeping a billion people together, for a long time after independence, it was the anti-colonial movement that sort of, kept all these people with their 60 languages and their 300 potato dishes all together because they'd all fought the colonial occupation. After a while, that generation started getting older, and there was the Cold War. What made sort of a common policy towards the outside world for India was the non-aligned movement, which had in it a narrative that many Indians and the foreign policy establishment found quite compelling, which is there are these superpowers. We know what superpowers do because we were colonized, and we will not be satellites to either one of them. We will form our own group of independent nation states that have a voice in the world. And, for what, the non-aligned movement, some people say was not effective or was, it certainly was effective in sort of giving a foreign policy purpose to many of the countries that came together under its aegis. And similarly, I think the BRICS plays that role, that now, for a long time after the Cold War ended, what became common for India, what held all these people together, was this idea of being a dynamic, growth-oriented economy. That worked for 2 decades. And then over the last few years, it became clear that this was not an automatic gift that would keep on giving. It required work. So that no longer was something that was holding the country together. And this idea of the BRICS, I think, has both sort of, foreign policy goals, an independent voice, that's neither we don't have superpowers now, although we may be coming back to that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but sort of an independent voice in terms of economic policy, in terms of environmental regulations, because remember, this is a group of countries that's still industrializing and may not share the kind of environmental goals that, say, Western Europe would like to see. So that's another area where there is absolutely common interest, and they would. And the third area is this idea of economic policy and financial regulation, that what makes sense for very advanced economies in terms of financial regulation may not be what's needed in countries where, quite frankly, banks haven't reached most of the population or much of the population in some cases. So I do think that there is a commonality, that there are interests that these countries share, but I'm not sure how you institutionalize it. Is the bank the best way to go? I mean, is there going to be enough of a corpus compared to, say, what the World Bank or the IMF has? No. Would it be a moral voice? And, the UN was at one point that sort of alternative voice on the world stage. Could this serve as an independent voice? It could perhaps, but I can certainly see that would be the interest that all of the BRICS would have in coming together institutionally. And I'll stop there, and maybe we'll have more of a chance to discuss later.
How you doing? Marcus, thank you very much for having me. I'm a Columbia grad, so it's a real pleasure to be back on campus. I'm going to focus on the questions that Marcus has asked us, which is economic situation in these individual countries, Russia specifically. In my case, Russia's perspective on BRICS and institutionalization of this formation, and I'll add to it a few thoughts on the investment concept of BRICS. Maybe that's not a bad place to start. Have a little historical perspective, and of course, we have to talk about the Ukraine sooner or later. So on the investment concept. This is an investment product, BRIC or BRICS, and it's really meant to push product. And we shouldn't be too focused on that, because if we want to make investments, we should analyze companies and their economics and look at management. BRICS was born as a high street financial product concept. If you look at BRICS right now, it's very, very different things. And we've been hearing consistently about. I can speak up a little bit. We've been hearing consistently about the concept of current account surplus or deficit, and concept of overall economic orientation, whether it be manufacturing or a commodity complex. These countries are all very different. You have India and Brazil and South Africa in the current account deficit, and highly dependent on global capital markets, and you have Russia and China in the current account surplus, in Russia's case perhaps dwindling, but nonetheless generating a lot of hard currency receipts. And in terms of orientation, obviously you have India and China as manufacturers for the world, and you have Brazil, South Africa, Russia very much in the commodity complex. And needless to say, everybody who's hooked on the global capital markets is having a hard time, because as growth is returning in the developed markets, the developing markets is not such an interesting proposition anymore. But in terms of the commodity complex and the ultimate demand, which really is China-driven, it's also not a very strong story. So, in terms of this investment concept, I'm not going to say what's left of it, because I think what's more important is where do we look in the context of this concept. And I think we got to look at something that's not as volatile, which is really China, which is East Asia, Southeast Asia. It's the German supply chain in Eastern Europe. It's Israel. It's countries which are generating inflows of currency, which have moderately appreciating currencies. I think from an investment point of view, this is not a bad place to start. So as far as Russia is concerned, I mentioned that it's a country which is currently very much about the commodity complex. It has a surplus, but what's really going on in Russia? So let's talk about that for a couple of minutes. Russia is, let's not beat around the bush, Russia is in an economic crisis. And it's not surprising to me that there's a war starting in the Russia's sphere of influence, because those things often go together, unfortunately. When I say crisis, what do I mean? Last year, GDP growth of 1.3%, and this year, a projection of about 2%, and CPI of 6.2%. So you do the math. The January investments are down by 7% year on year. That's the worst result in 4 years. And January retail sales growing at 2.4% year on year. That's also the slowest indicator in 4 years. The balance sheet is still strong. You have, if you back out monetary gold and encumbered reserves, you have about 239 billion in central bank reserves, and perhaps I should be careful to quote these numbers, because I might make a mistake, but I think they're roughly right. 239 in unencumbered money, of which 139 is in treasuries, so about 100 billion left. It's a big number, but then the new head of central bank, over the last 6 months, she spent 56 billion, so 100 left. In the last 6 months, 56 spent on effectively defending the ruble. Guess what? Guess how much was spent this past Monday? 1 day, 11 billion. Granted, it's a very, very special day, very sad day for the peace-loving people of the world. But and I don't mean it facetiously. It's trouble. There's a lot of trouble on Monday. But 11 billion in currency sold to support the ruble on Monday. So balance sheet is strong, but balance sheet is also shrinking. And a big problem in Russia is where do these slow GDP growth numbers come from? It's a commodity complex economy, weak demand from its ultimate client in Europe. Europe is in crisis. Weak domestic demand. And what's happening now is a lot of Russian consumer goods are imported, and what you have is with ruble being where it is, you're seeing the inflation numbers at 6% and rising. So there's now this standoff between basically the Ministry of Finance, which wants to devalue the ruble so local businesses, export-oriented businesses are making better profits. But when you have so much import, we talked about India and the effect of inflation on the well-being of the people, it becomes very problematic. So the central bank is defending the ruble because it doesn't want inflation expectations to get off the hook. So very, very difficult situation, basically no growth, structural inflation because there's always dollars coming in from the oil trade. Inflation is rising because of what's happening with the curtailing of the easing programs around the world. But there's nothing much that Russia can do because you basically either you get inflation and people hit the streets, or you get the high labor costs and businesses that are not particularly competitive globally, and this is where the country is at right now. What's being done to reform it? Obviously, in Russia, there's a lot of work being done on diversifying the economy, but it's not trivial. It's a very difficult thing to achieve, particularly because of the governance problems in the country. And there's a saying, fish rots from the head, and you can look at that, and you can look at the phenomenon of the Dutch disease, and you have your understanding of what the problem is with Russia. Governance is poor, and the country is making progress in that department. It's rising in the ranks of ease of doing business, but it's still a very inefficient economy to do business in. And if you look on a micro level, well, why aren't people just sorting it out in terms of specific investments that they're making, whether it be private equity or foreign direct investment? This is really not the kind of environment where some Columbia grad can control an enterprise, through her, principal role at some fund, because it requires, a lobbying effort, security, just a host of resources that are really belong to the conglomerates as opposed to financial services businesses. And if you look at conglomerates who are capable of leveraging such resources, these are businesses that are run by old generation of oligarchs who grew up in the Soviet system and are not really capable of creating organizational structures to achieve success. So from my point of view, the biggest problem in terms of reforming the economy is establishing the rule of law. This is to my point about fish rotting from the head, independent courts, and really educating and importing management, basically talent. I'll talk very briefly about the bilateral trade within the BRIC group, just to give you a sense for where Russia stands. Obviously, China is the biggest partner for Russia. It's got bilateral trade of about 50 billion US. It's clear what it's about. It's energy into China. There was a huge deal signed by Rosneft in November, 100 million tons with Sinopec. There's LNG through Novatek with CNPC, and manufactured goods going back. This is the biggest opportunity for Russia in the BRIC bloc, and the two countries are working towards doubling the amount of this trade in the next 5 years. The second biggest partner is India. The bilateral trade is 10 billion, and it's primarily about fertilizer into India and pharmaceuticals from India back into Russia. And Brazil is number 3 with 6 billion of bilateral trade. Brazil is buying air defense technology, aircraft, missiles, and Russia is buying half of Brazilian beef, basically, exportable Brazilian beef. To my point about inflation, think about what this is going to cost as inflation speeds up. Russia is interested in promoting nuclear opportunities, nuclear energy opportunities in Brazil. Same with South Africa, where there's virtually no bilateral trade. It's about $1 billion a year. And some commodities flowing into Russia from South Africa, and Russia primarily pursuing nuclear power projects over there. So that's to give you a sense for how they interact with each other. Now, a little bit about BRICS on a political, from a political point of view. Politically, BRICS, a very simple mental model for me is it's like an embryonic G8. That's what it is from Russia's point of view, and I think a lot of the leadership in these countries views BRICS from that perspective. These countries want to participate in deciding on global issues, and Russia is in the G8 for how long I don't know, but it's in the G8 for now. But China isn't, and India and Brazil and South Africa, they have no representation in these global clubs and would like to have it. So what Marcus was saying about creation of a development bank, these are the first steps in institutionalizing. Right now, there is no institutional character to BRICS. It doesn't have a secretariat. It only has its summits as a vehicle for cooperation, but it's slowly changing. So it certainly has potential from Russia's point of view, and it ties into Russia's desire to see the world having multiple poles, if you wish, and we can view it positively, we can view it negatively from a kind of an imperialistic point of view. But it is what it is, and Russia is involved in this conflict right now in the Ukraine, which obviously is a very complicated situation, and there's a lot of there's a real informational war underway. So it makes it difficult for us to really assign blame, even though I think it's not that difficult. But it's nonetheless it's all very confusing. But what's happening is that Russia was obviously, the Ukrainians didn't want Russia ultimately in the new Ukrainian deal, and Russia wants to be in the new Ukrainian deal at any cost, and this is how it plays out. So this is, we're here under the auspices of SIPA, so I'll say this, for the next generation of American diplomats, I think it's very critical to understand national interests, and not just national interests in terms of sort of the most progressive part of the society, let's say urban liberal intelligentsia, but also simply the agenda of the elite, because these folks actually run the show. And Russia has deeply entrenched interests in the Crimea, and whether the involvement there is legal or not, and I certainly tend to the side of being highly critical of how this has been executed. Crimea was conquered by Catherine the Great 250 years ago. It's wasn't, when the USSR was formed, it wasn't part of the Ukrainian Republic. Khrushchev in '54, he was a kind of a Ukrainian, a very proud Ukrainian himself, when he was celebrating the 300th anniversary of the establishment of the Ukrainian state. He, at a party in Crimea, he actually gave Crimea as a gift to the Republic of the Ukraine. It wasn't seen as a big deal back in the day. Yeltsin, under very similar circumstances in '91, basically signed off on the borders of the Ukraine as they were at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but other options were being discussed, one of them being pre-revolutionary borders, which were all north of the Black Sea. So it's very important that we be realists, and we stay true to our principles as human beings and have a judgment, but also don't fool ourselves and look at the situation with clarity. And what's being played out is Russia, in the context of BRICS, these emerging nations, is fighting for its place, and is fighting dirty. Often I think everybody in the global scene is fighting dirty. It's just what it is. So I thank you for this opportunity to present my views, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, my name is Fernando Sotelino, and as my colleagues in the panel, I'll address Professor Troyjo's questions. And again, thank you for the invitation. But I'm going to do that trying to focus on one particular angle, which in my opinion is one, if not the most critical milestone of the process of economic development of any emerging economy. BRICS, MINTS, Fragile Five, or any other acronym that we may choose. And that is the ability to have in place what we could call a functional financial system, a financial system that is functional to economic development. By functional, I mean a financial system that is capable of providing long-term credit in domestic currency at interest rates that are affordable, that are compatible with the financing of long-term investment. Now, the literature identifies 7 preconditions for you or for a country, for a society to say we have long-term, robust credit markets. 1, rule of law. 2, free market formation of interest rates. 3, state-of-the-art, modern operational systems, from the back offices of banks to exchanges and so on and so forth. 4, the existence of borrowers, of strong private sector borrowers with a history of accounting standards that lenders and or investors can rely on. The existence of solid financial intermediaries. The existence of a sound regulatory framework for banks and for the capital markets. And 7, last but not least, a favorable sovereign yield curve in domestic currency. Now, if we were to compare emerging market economies, and we have no time to do this, Brazil would most likely rank among the very top on the first 6, but fail miserably on number 7, its domestic yield curve in reais. We have here in the panel one individual who helped in 2003 deal with that reality as a moment of delicate political transition was taking place. Mr. Canuto here was part of a special committee of independent economists that was happening then. The Minister of Finance transitioned through this rough waters, so he may have some comments on that later. Now, on this yield curve in domestic currency per se, I have in front of me a nice table with 6 columns and 8 lines comparing numbers for the 5 BRICS to include South Africa and 3 MINTs, Mexico, Indonesia, and Turkey, and basically quantifying and showing this unfavorable yield curve. So I'm just going to give you a number. I understand from Professor Marcos that we'll be able to put this on a website and you can enjoy this table because there are other considerations you may want to come up with. But just to call your attention that as of last Saturday, which is when I checked markets, Brazil was paying 5.15% over inflation on its federal funds with daily liquidity, and was paying close to 7% over inflation on its 10-year government bond in reais. Now, this is much higher than anybody else. Even Turkey, that is acknowledged as having a very high real interest rate. This 6.83% for Brazil as of last Saturday, I did it when the markets closed. It was 2.6 for Turkey. Now, at this level of interest rates, how can an entrepreneur consider committing to borrow? If the government is paying 12.5, how much would they have to pay? 15, 16, fixed for 10 years? to finance investment, particularly in a country where inflation has been 5 to 6, and the midpoint of the inflation target range is 4.5. Impossible. I would not be able to do that. And to finance investment in floating rates or in a foreign exchange rate, you bring in the volatility of the Brazilian Fed funds rate, which is very high. I have another table for that. I'm not going to bore you with that. Or if you borrow in foreign exchange, either you have to be a major exporter or you're bringing in the exchange rate risk, which is very high, very expensive to hedge against, when not impossible if the duration is more than 2 or 3 years. So we'll say, but come on, if that is the case, how come has Brazil built one of the most robust corporate private sectors in the world? Well, there was one way out, a very creative and powerful crutch that was put in place in the mid-60s, which was special funding for Brazil's National Bank of Development. In the mid-60s, the government then came up with the idea of let's create a fund. It is really an unemployment insurance for workers. And this fund has been the main source of cheap funding for the National Bank of Development to own land to the private sector. As of today, the National Bank of Development lends to the private sector, borrowers, as well as other banks for them to own land to their clients at a base rate which is revised every quarter by the Brazilian Monetary Council of 5%, which is 575 basis points below the Fed funds today. But still, it's kind of a line with the long-term inflation. The problem is that this cheap source of funding that used to account for 75% of the total assets of the National Bank of Development had already dropped to some 60% in 2008. And now it's 25%. So what I'm suggesting is that the cost of funds of the National Bank of Development has continuously marched towards approaching Brazil's yield curve. So the degree of subsidy that would be required to sustain the situation becomes harder and harder to maintain. If you add to that the point that I've made before, which is the volatility of the floating rate per se, Brazil has had, when you compare to the other countries, has shown in moments of shock, be it the self-inflicted political transition of 2002 that had to be managed with the help of individuals like Mr. Canuto, and we can talk again about that later. Be it that Brazil was probably the one of the only countries in the world that raised its Fed funds rate in 2008. When it became clear that Lehman had failed, the global credit crunch had materialized in the aftermath of U.S. subprime meltdown, Brazil had to raise interest rates. Why? Because the exchange rate had suffered a devaluation of some 50%. Exchange rate devaluation hits inflation. You have inflation targeting. How do you control that? You raise interest rates. So I'm just inviting you to think from the standpoint, not even of lenders, but borrowers. You need stability of your expected funding costs to be able to invest. And that has been something very difficult to achieve. So just cutting through the chase, in light of all this, what we can, let me just add another point of a political dimension. One of the things that if you are reading about Brazil, you're probably aware of, is that one way that Brazil has used to maintain a growth of some 2% on average since 2011. The 2008 crisis caused negative GDP growth in 2009. just like the 2002 self-inflicted transition imposed negative growth in 2003. In 2009, there was negative growth, and the government began to be more, have greater fiscal laxity, to say the least. So 2009, minus 1%. 2011, back to 7.5, positive. But then, since then, 2011, 2012, 2013, around 2%. During this period, since 2008, Brazil has cut its fiscal target, its primary fiscal surplus target, from 3.8% to 2.9%. Brazil has also used some creative mechanisms to meet these targets. Analysts at large, and credit rating agencies in particular, have been paying attention to this. These creative mechanisms are not illegal. It's basically something like having higher dividend payouts from government-controlled companies, so increase revenues, while at the same time extending treasury loans to public sector banks. But the reality is that all this has come to the attention of the investment community, and therefore it becomes harder and harder to continue. So what I would like, in terms of looking forward, the point that I would like to make is that even though people debate about ideology and political orientations in Brazil, what party is going to win the elections in 2014, my view is that regardless of who wins, Brazil will be in a path back to what they call the tripod of economic guidance, which is fiscal discipline, inflation targeting, and floating exchange rate. Because the party in power would most likely remember the magnitude of the economic disruptions of 2002 and is aware of what the market at large is saying about creative government accounting, I would say that this tripod would most likely remain in place and be even restored to greater robustness in terms of rigor and implementation. Now, with that in mind, the forecast would be what I would call sustainable but mediocre growth in the range of the 2% that Ivan just concluded with for Russia today. And coincidentally, troubling inflation at not much less than 5%. So it's a continued mulling through, sustainable, but somewhat mediocre by this very large economy, unless the country finds the political will to go back to the path, I should say, of the structural reforms we started debating today. There's no, I don't know if we have time to debate today what they are. But like in many other countries, political conditions, political considerations have led to accommodation instead of pursuit of significant improvement in overall institutionalization. And this particular BRIC and emerging economy has all in its favor in the 6 categories I mentioned before, and is really not looking good on number 7. But again, that it's an aspect of political conviction and political will. In closing, just regarding the BRICS No Development Bank, what I would say is that, in my opinion, it would do very little to help what I consider to be the Achilles heel of the economic development process of these countries, and in the case of Brazil, the yield curve itself. But at the same time, it can be a forum for intelligent debate. I see it more bilateral than collective for specific initiatives. And as also suggested here before, I see each country trying to lever on the BRICS leverage on the BRICS to have a stronger say internationally. So there is a little bit, in my opinion, of a prisoner's dilemma and a little bit of a game theory to be explored among the 5 parties. Who's going to benefit more from this getting together, and as a result, a stronger position in the different G8 and other forum around the world. I hope it was fast enough, and again, also look forward to debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fernando, Ivan, Atsi, and Loy, Otaviano for the enlightened and stimulating remarks. We do have a few minutes for a Q&A session. There are microphones there at the audience, so please raise your hand. There you have the second gentleman there, was the first one to raise it. Please state your name and address the question to whoever you want to in the panel. The one behind, yes, please.
Alexander Gevorkian, Assistant Professor of Economics, St. John's, and I've taught at Columbia Economics Department as well. First of all, thanks for organizing the panel, and thanks to panelists for your interesting perspectives. I think we all agree that BRICS is a convenient concept, but not necessarily a robust one in terms of Mr. Canuto, your comments. In terms of comparing, so let me move the microphone so I can see you. In terms of comparing the economies, you mentioned something very interesting. What matters is the absolute size. And I think I understand, but I would like you maybe to elaborate a little bit more, because as you pointed out, there is quite a bit of analysis that goes with growth rates and other aspects, other indicators, but absolute size of the economy, I think, matters quite a bit as well. So if you could elaborate, and really follow up to Mr. Isakov's, your questions, because I think it relates to your comments. It relates to, you mentioned about the conglomerates in Russia and the conglomerate structures being incapable of adapting to the new methods and so on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term the gazelle economies that is popularized in Russia now, referring to smaller firms emerging in new sectors, specifically IT. Just your perspective, what do you think, if there is any dynamics, momentum in that, in bringing the change? So thank you very much.
What about if we take the second as well?
You want to take this? Okay, very good.
Makes it easier.
Let's take 2 at a time.
Thank you very much. I'm Haider Rida, manager at Bain & Company in the private equity and energy practices. I was very happy to see that most of the panel was very optimistic. Mr. Canuto mentioned he was an optimist. Mr. Pires mentioned that the world is getting better. The stories from China and India were very positive too. The reason I was happy with that is that recently there's been a lot of academic and business talk about how the world as such should get happy with 1 or 2% growth on a global scale for the industrialized markets. So when we look back at the Industrial Revolution till now, for 250 years we had 4% on an average. Before the Industrial Revolution we were below 1%. And now they're saying, like, in the future we need to get back to be happy with 1% or 2%. What I don't really get in that story is that I strongly believe that this time in history is the best time in history up till now, because there is more knowledge, there is more freedom, there is more technology, etc., etc. So if we do believe that this time is so much better than all these times before, why would these drivers of progress, like technology, like freedom, like knowledge sharing, not be able to also provide us with a 4% or even more going forward? So A, do you believe that indeed we need to be happy with 1 to 2% going forward? And B, if you do believe that, why is it that these drivers can't bring us to more than 4% in the future going forward? Thank you.
Maybe I can start and everybody weighs in. And the two questions are very much convergent. Look, Brazil is growing now, as of now, at the potential rate, something in the range of 2 to 3% as of now. But if you look at the 20% poor, for more than 10 years, their income grew at more than 6% a year. Put this into account. This is Chinese-like rates of growth. And that's why you have had such a switch of people above the poverty line. Ask these people how they're seeing life. Ask them if they are feeling better off. So much more important maybe than average GDP growth rates in many of these countries. What has, and this has been remarkable in the last 20 years, I'm talking about data, and Loy said them all. You look at everywhere, and people are moving up the poverty above the poverty line. So this is the yardstick that gives optimism to many people, not average growth rates, which may be meaningless if they are fully concentrated. Do you think the 3% income growth in the U.S. is really the representative figure that we should be looking at? If we take into account that the bottom of the pyramid has not benefited at all of whatever has happened in the 20 last years here. So take with a grain of salt, simply focusing on GDP growth. Some of these figures are very sometimes convenient, particularly if you are under a panel looking at how to allocate and how to convince your client to take money out of that country and put elsewhere for financial reasons and so on. If you look at the household surveys in all these countries, they show you a reality that is sometimes very much discrepant to GDP. Second point, and related to this, when I said it's stupid to compare current rates of growth of China with anybody else, it's because of the following. China has undergone in the last 30 years a process, and China has done it extremely well in many regards. But it's the same process that happened in Japan, that happened in Brazil, in some parts of Latin America during the decades of 50, 60, and 70. And it's the same process that happened with the tigers in each and every place in the planet in which a country moved from low-income levels to middle-income levels, which is a process characterized by a transfer of people from subsistence-like activities, and without requiring them to increase their skills or even levels of education, these people, usually this process is associated with urbanization, these people start dealing, working with existing standardized technologies, and the total factor productivity rises dramatically in all these cases. And that's why the word miracle shows off periodically in each of these countries, periods in which the growth rate is extremely high. Again, China has done this so well because China has not done some of the mistakes that took place in Latin America, doing this in a closed manner and so on. Now, China knew, as everybody knew, that this process is limited after a certain point, either because the surplus labor, and by the way, some of you who have done the course of development economics read this through Sir Arthur Lewis' model that gave him the Nobel Prize. Everybody knows that this, in China knew that this process is limited because after a certain point, the low-hanging fruits of the transfer and increase of total productivity has an end. So then, and only a couple of countries have gone through the next step almost smoothly. And these are 7 countries among 110 that were classified by the World Bank as middle-income countries in 1960. Only 7 of these countries went over to become high-income countries. 5 of them in Asia. 3 of them were not really countries. Hong Kong, Taiwan, China. See? Singapore. Yeah, but see how I say Taiwan, China, right? I lose my job if I don't say it that way. Hong Kong, China. And then you have Korea and Japan. And besides them, Mauritius. And Mauritius has a lot to do with China as well. And Israel. So that's why China is looking afraid, because the next step, and Ant was quite good in describing it, is not maybe as easy as the previous one, because it will require an institutional revolution. China will have to resemble more a market economy. What has functioned as market economy in the export processing zones in the sectors that have been liberated, now the model will have to move to banking and to other sectors, because there's no other known history of a country that had developed innovative capacity without being that way, with the property rights, with more market-related institutional environment, and so on. And so this is the next step. So going back, and this is so-called middle-income trap. When people, once I gave an interview on middle-income trap, and someone told me that, the word gets like fire in China, because everyone is concerned with that. So that it doesn't make it, the slowdown Chinese growth rates. Now, once in a while, I see sometimes what I consider, with due respect, stupid analysis. One thing is for China, for instance, to grow 7% in the next 10 years. From a political standpoint, is much, much, much more socially sound than growing at 10% in the old pattern, because the old pattern was based on what? On crunching consumption and huge investment to GDP. So China growing at 7% or even 6% a year, if it's based on domestic consumption, the feeling of comfort of the population is much higher than before. So neither the Chinese rates of growth of the last 30 years are to be straightforward compared to the current ones, nor you can compare what's happening in China now with the other countries. It doesn't make any sense. Russia is a country where the population is shrinking. See, that's another ball game, nothing to do with coming up from low levels. India is where there is a shortfall, in the sense that even though the space has been opened for the people in sophisticated service, no deal has been made to open the possibility of having the Chinese, like industrial processes, lifting people in India out of poverty. So take with a grain of salt all these GDP-only related comparisons.
On the question of the emerging tech economy, growth economy in Russia, I don't study the Russian economy per se, but I can give you my conclusions based on what I see in the real economy. And what I see is that there's definitely company creation taking place in the tech scene. A couple of government initiatives, most notably Skolkovo, which I'm sure Colombia has a lot of contacts with, but I think that's the less interesting part of the story. The more interesting part of the story is that there've been there are multiple successful entrepreneurs who've sold off their businesses, generated money, and are now reinvesting it in the technology sector. So you can call them angel investors or early stage VC investors. And that scene is surprisingly integrated with the Silicon Valley. I mean, those people know each other. They go back and forth a lot. There's a lot of outsourcing deals. Actually, Ukraine is big in terms of outsourcing. Luxsoft and EPAM coded companies have big Ukrainian programming teams. So there's this angel and VC investment going into this emerging tech economy. On that level, you can call it angel round, first round. There's a lot of company creation and very interesting things going on, but it's very small. It's very small and it's very speculative. These people really are involved in just making money, and it's not It's not a sector per se. It's a very distinct phenomenon. In terms of the middle stage, sort of later stage growth companies, there's a lot less money there just because there's no deal flow. So there's very few companies in the tech space that have $50 million in revenue. There's a lot of them that have $1 million or $2 million, a lot, and then there's a lot that, not a lot, but there's plenty that make a couple of $100 million. But in the middle, there's very little, so there's not really sources of funding for that stage. So that's going to happen over time, I think. It's heading there. And once you sort of pass that point, then you start running into Russian issues, which is distortion of the competitive field and very tough M&A tactics by big players, lots and lots of monopolies. So basically, if you're good, if you're smart, if you got a great idea, you're networked, you'll get funded, your business will grow, then you're going to have a hard time getting it funded once it reaches a certain level. But if you're very connected and if you're very smart, you'll find a way, and you'll make it further. And then it gets quite difficult because there's really capital markets, let's say public equity markets are not really very receptive to Russian equity nowadays. And if you are dealing with the big players, it's going to be tough to make a big return. So actually, I'm not going to go into it here, but there's many examples of entrepreneurial companies having real difficulties, founders of those companies having real difficulties exiting. Eurostate is one very good example. So you can get some money out, but then you get a one-way ticket to London on top. So it's a little tough. I mean, to sum it up, I would say that there's definitely company creation. The scale is small, and the big challenge is to create later stage financing and to normalize the competitive field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one question coming this way, another one back there. So we have one here, the other there. Yes.
First of all, thank you all for your fascinating speech. And it's Elham Saidinejad, and I'm a postdoc in Institute for New Economic Thinking. And actually, my question is from Anli or Mr. Canuto about China, and also because Anli was very optimistic about the future role of renminbi, like as an international reserve, and I'm just not as optimistic as Anli is, and about given that China has all these restrictions, like institutional restriction, I don't know how China is going to be international world reserve currency in future. I can imagine China be like international trade currency, but not like the kind of currency that other countries necessarily want to keep. So I would be grateful if you could answer that.
Let's just hear the second question, and yes, thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to comment on Otaviano's. I was going to comment on your point as to the quality of GDP, because I think the quality of GDP is really what's the driver from this point forward. And that's a point that Levon Zhu, the chairman of CICC, has been talking about a lot in China as well, because the same questions we're finding throughout the world. If you're in Taiwan, they're talking about job creation. We're talking about that here in the United States as well, and income inequality as well is being talked about as well. And then Anne had spoken about Jim O'Neill and the term BRICS. In that same 2005 research article, the phrase N11 was coined as well, the next group. That next group now is becoming the manufacturing engine of the world. So you have, for example, 1 out of every 6 cars now being manufactured in Mexico, soon to be 1 out of every 4 cars. So really what China is doing structurally, and that's why, for example, the CSRC suspended for a year public offerings in China to try to get to a more process-driven result as opposed to the subjective as it has been right now, is to really come forward and adopt models which will allow the country to get to the next level of productivity, which will be based upon transparency, rule of law, and far more innovation. So it's really more of a comment than a question in terms of underscoring the need for structural reform, because you started the discussion today with hubris, complacency. There's no room for hubris and complacency, given the dynamics of the world and how the BRIC countries are going to have to compete with the N11, as well as with the United States, because of the reshoring trend and the significant advantage that the U.S. is having going forward because of its energy efficiency and being on the road to becoming a net energy exporter, as well as the innovation and human capital and resources that we have here as well.
So thanks for asking that question about whether China has the potential to be a reserve currency as opposed to just a trade settlement currency. Well, it is true that up until now, China's had very strict capital controls in terms of its capital flows for hot money, because they see that as being very antithetical to development. And this is why that they have been very careful about rolling this out. They've seen the mistakes of other countries and so want to be very methodical about it, which is why that they've ensured that they've got a lot of bilateral agreements with many countries around the world to have central banks hold Chinese bonds as reserve currencies by getting them to settle in the yuan. And over time, as other countries become more comfortable, then China will be willing to open it up for capital flows. That's aside from foreign direct investments and trade. And this is why I mentioned that they are using Shanghai as their first testing ground. I'm sure that they're going to run into a lot of issues, and when things get out of control, I'm sure they would probably put the brakes on again until they figure out how to fix it. China has not really focused on its financial industry up until now, and so they do not have a very deep bench of financial talent to draw upon, and so this is going to take some time to develop, and so. But what they do understand is that this is an area of focus and this is a goal of theirs. And given that they've had a very strong track record of achieving their goals, I'm quite certain that if they decide that they want to make the renminbi a reserve currency, they'll do what it takes to get there, whether it happens, in 5 years' time or 25 years' time, no one quite knows. But this is not something I'm saying that's going to happen overnight. And like I said, it comes in small increments. But I basically would say that if I were a betting person, I would bet that they would be able to accomplish it.
I think this issue epitomizes quite well what we're talking about China. They know the direction, but the timing is endogenous. It depends on the stones. You walk across the river stone by stone, and certainly the thing is nobody knows exactly what they're going to look like. But China will look like more a market economy beyond the sectors where it is today. And then the question is how this process happens. How are the new institutions created? Nobody relinquishes power, so there's going to be a struggle. But at the same time, success will hinge on that, because there's no such a thing as an innovative state-led economy. And by the way, let me make an anecdote about this. Recently, I was in a seminar of a think tank, a Chinese think tank, and in Brazilian Getúlio Vargas Foundation. And the major conclusion was something of the following. China has a lot to learn from Brazil on social policies, because this is going to be part of the new pact. In order to have domestic consumption, the households will only save less if there is some provision of education and health. So that's the next step. Not by chance. The reform of the Hoku is there a top topic in the reform priority. Well, China has a lot to learn from all the successful social programs in Brazil, whereas Brazil has a lot to learn about capitalism from China. That's the which epitomizes as well what we're talking. On quality, that's it. We should take with a grain of salt many of these conventional, because they lost the meaning in many cases. I come here to this country. Does it make sense to measure well-being of a substantial part of the population by simply look at the GDP? It doesn't. Just look at the evolution of the purchasing power of the poor Americans. They have been in dire straits for 2 decades. So come on, don't talk about prosperity in such conditions. And it's true. The BRIC is the convenient grouping at a certain moment, but the process goes much beyond, and the competition is out there, and including a fight back from the U.S.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunately going to have to adjourn. I'm sorry for this. I want to thank you very much for coming. I want to thank Otaviano. I want to thank Loy, and Atsi, Ivan, and Fernando. I think we had a terrific debate. Many questions are in our mind, but we've also been we leave this room very enlightened. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Center on Global Economic Governance and ask you all to save the date of November 15th when we have the annual BRICLab conference. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.